Hey, so I woke up this morning to a message where someone was asking me about the Jupiter Saturn conjunction coming up. Um, and I kind of looked through some of the posts that I made, and I realized I'd been talking about a lot of stuff going on around this Jupiter Saturn conjunction, like it's eclipse season and they're ingressing into Aquarius and stuff like that, but I haven't really made a very specific post that's just about Jupiter Saturn. And it's like a pretty big deal, so I figured I haven't done one of these videos for a while, so maybe this is a good chance to just record a little video where I go over it. Haven't really prepared any notes. But it's all kind of in my head. Hopefully, this comes out smooth enough here. So, where do we start? Jupiter Saturn conjunction. Now, having a Jupiter Saturn conjunction happens about 20 years or so. This in itself is not really that extraordinary because, it happens every 20 years. This particular one is more interesting, though, for a number of reasons. Um, if we look at Jupiter Saturn conjunctions, historically they were called the Grand Conjunction or the Conjunction of Kings. Um, why is that? Well, if we look at Jupiter and Saturn as planets, Saturn is the farthest planet that you can see with the naked eye in the night sky. And so it's the furthest planet away that has the longest orbit. So it's generally said to rule over long term things like long term commitments, the process itself of aging and getting older, all that kind of stuff. Jupiter and these being more bigger bigger cycles, longer cycles. So less of like flavor of the week and more of like these big changes that last for a long time. And from that, they were generally used to gain information about what was happening at the more of the collective level, more of the governmental level, more of the level of civilizations and empires. So when we're talking about Jupiter Saturn conjunctions, it's putting more of a focus on these big collective things that are happening. And in a year of 2020, I think it's sort of like we kind of get a picture of how those big collective things can have an impact because we're not talking about this little thing that's just kind of messed up my life and made things inconvenient, but we're talking about something that we're all going through as a collective society, in terms of the coronavirus pandemic and whatever restrictions are around that. So we already have this sense of big things happening at a big collective level, even without going into the astrology. And so maybe it's a bit suiting to see the Jupiter Saturn conjunction happening in a year like this. Um, what is interesting about these grand conjunctions is that if you look at this, you go 20 years by 20 years, and you look at what signs they happen in. They tend to happen in this pattern where they fall into signs of the same element. Um, so this so if you think about like Aquarius being an air element, you're looking at Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, etc. So what we're entering into right now is the change, basically. Now it's kind of like it's not really an abrupt change, I have to say, because the last 40 years have been this sort of period of like wiggle room, maybe, or what you say, it's a kind of a transition between the period, an Earth period into an air period. So if we rewind back to around 1980, 1981, they had the first Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Libra. So that was an air Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Libra. Then around 2000, around the time George W. Bush got elected, and you had September 11th and stuff like that, then you had a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Taurus. And then now that we're in 2020, we're having a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. Um, and it's kind of like, even now, it's sort of like these planets are nearly conjunct right now in Capricorn, so it's sort of like making the conjunction in Capricorn and then moving into Aquarius. And then for the next 200 years, all these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions are going to be happening in air signs, in Gemini, in Libra, in Aquarius. So and what you could also say is that if you take into account that the four elements and stuff like that, it's probably been about 800 years or so since these Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions were happening in air signs. That we had this beginning of an air period. So it's sort of like the clock hand of this big 800-year cycle coming around to the starting position again. If you mark air as the starting position, but 800 years before you get to the same element again. So we're talking about really big kind of underlying kind of cosmic cycles here. Which also, it kind of rings the questions like, is this the dawning of the age of Aquarius? And from a technical standpoint, unfortunately, no. When people talk about the age of Aquarius, what they're talking about is this idea that has to do with the precession of the equinoxes. So that's basically has to do with a kind of a drift where slowly but surely the equinox point isn't matching up with the same constellations anymore, and so like when you have spring solstice, rather than spring solstice happening when the sun's around where the constellation of Aries is, it's more in the direction of the constellation of Pisces. Oh, here's the cat getting in the way. Hi, Jackie. Do you want to come here, Jackie? You want to be a lap cat? Okay. So, what was I saying? The precession of the equinoxes. So the precession of the equinoxes, the idea of the age of Aquarius is the age of Aquarius is supposed to start when the spring solstice point is happening more in the constellation of Aquarius than Pisces, right? Now you can watch a good video from the Astrology podcast on this, but it's kind of a tricky one to really pinpoint when the so-called age of Aquarius is supposed to happen, because basically where do you measure the beginning of the Aquarius constellation from, if that's what you're using, right? And it's a kind of a mistake, a misassumption that people think that astrology is necessarily all about just reading where, like, oh, the sun is really close to this specific constellation, and so it means this. The constellations themselves are kind of uneven. It's not like you have these neatly organized constellations that each take up 1/12 of the sky. Some constellations are much bigger, some constellations are much smaller, and it's also the way we do astrology, we just divide things up like months, right? Like 12 months in a year, and they're all more or less equal 30 days, or give or take, or whatever. And so you've got like a pie that's divided into 12 parts. When it comes to if you're just going off of constellations, it's a little bit like, are you dividing things up equally? Are you using the stars? And like, where do you mark one point to the, it's a bit of a fuzzy thing. And for that reason, people have kind of been saying we're moving into the age of Aquarius, but nobody has quite come up with an agreement of what specific date marks the entrance of the age of Aquarius. And furthermore, apparently, it's something that's not even really that ancient of an idea. It's more of something that's been invented. It's kind of part of the modern New Age movement, where they're like anticipating the dawn of a new age and using this astrological precession of the equinoxes to kind of time it and give it meaning and stuff. But it's a relatively new idea, apparently. The guy I learned astrology from, Adam Ellenboss, also known as Akuta Bhavadas, he does some good videos on this material of the why the age of Aquarius is kind of more of a new agey thing than a traditional astrology thing. Okay. Small correction. I was watching the video and I realized I was saying spring solstice when I should have been saying spring equinox. I was just trying to get all this stuff in my head, and I kind of misspoke there. So we've got, it's not just a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it's a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that is marking the beginning of this new 200-year era that is defined by the air element. Now, that's not even the only thing which makes it interesting, right? So that in itself is a pretty big deal. But if you look at the timing of it, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction perfects, these planets become tightly conjunct with each other around the time of the winter solstice. And so, if you know anything about astrology, the equinox points and the solstice points are pretty crucial, pivotal times of the year because they mark, the solstices mark in winter the lack of light, the darkest time of the year. In the summer, the most light, the highest time of the year. And so, we get there's a lot of meaning just based on that, right? To have this happening, this big thing happening, and it just so happens to happen at a solstice point, right? And that, and on top of all this stuff, I mean, like, it's potential that you could have a different point in time a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that's just happening like in the middle of a sign, right? This isn't happening at the middle of the sign. This is happening at the end of a sign and then ingressing into the next sign at the point where it's perfecting at the solstice point. So it's like it's like really kind of piling up the sort of levels of significance, and it's sort of, I've heard astrology explained as sort of reading into these kinds of accidental, incidental things, right? Like, it's sort of like a coincidence that of you having this big conjunction that's marking this 200-year cycle, and it just so happens to be like right on the cusp of the signs when it's happening, and it just so happens to be right on the winter solstice. And also, I mean, you could also get into the fact how it just so happens that it perfects a square with the planet Uranus at the same time, right? If you want to get into some more of the modern astrology, outer planet stuff, that's all stuff that we can go into. And I think to get like an understanding, I mean, I've kind of told you now about some of the reasons why this is significant, but it doesn't, aside from just being generally vaguely a big collective thing happening, you might be asking, well, that's great, but what, what does this thing stand for? What does it mean, right? And so for that, we look at the sign of Aquarius, which is moving into. Then, I mean, to some extent, we could also look at Capricorn as well and get an idea of the transition between the two. But understanding what Aquarius means as a sign. Aquarius is symbolized by the water pourer. And part of the sort of the myth of the symbol of the water pourer, you would have kings and rulers, and they would have a trusted servant to be the one that would pour the water, that would serve them, because the idea is that when you've got somebody so close to you, that you need somebody you can really trust, or else they might be poisoning the water, kind of thing, right? Like, if somebody wanted to overthrow the king and take the throne for himself and stuff like that, if your servants have access to you all the time, they might be the most perfect people to like plot an assassination or something like this. So you had to have somebody who had sworn a kind of oath of loyalty. And sometimes this is like, I don't know if I'm gonna get the word right, but it's called like a eunuch. The people who've basically been castrated or sterilized. This was something that was common in ancient medieval times, where you'd have the closest servants to the royal family would themselves be sterilized, so that because the whole, the royal bloodline thing, if you were not able to produce offspring, you would, like, if you stole the throne from the king, what good is that gonna do for you? Because then you can't, like, you wouldn't be able to reproduce, and then some other family would have to take the throne. So it was kind of like this thing of like forced sterilization as a kind of insurance policy, more or less, to make sure your servants weren't going to overthrow you. Um, and I and with it's kind of interesting to read that with what's going on. Obviously, there might be a lot of controversy around whether or not vaccines are mandatory or not, for example, right? Um, there's also this, but the underlying kind of theme about Aquarius is more of this kind of thing as taking an oath, taking a vow, taking a kind of a pledge of service, making a kind of self-sacrifice for some sort of like, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be this idea of just like pledging your loyalty to some authority figure, but it could be pledging your loyalty to some sort of higher cause or some kind of a higher ideal. And it's not, it's opposite. The Aquarius sits opposite to the sign of Leo in astrology. And Leo is a summer sign, so it's warm and sunny. It's a solar sign ruled by the sun. And so Leo kind of has more of this quality of, I would say, maybe like self gratification to it, of being more kind of like showing off the personality, showing off the ego, maybe being a bit of a performer, maybe, or there's a certain kind of, it's kind of ingratiating to the solar ego, whereas the Aquarius, traditionally a Saturn ruled sign, is more of like, I'm the guy who's like the servant, or it's kind of like you're stepping out of the limelight and kind of you're working hard and making a kind of a sacrifice, but it's not just to like build up your own name, you build up your own image. It's more of this kind of like the service comes before the self. It's like doing it's the work. It's not about your own personal success, your own personal making yourself into the king. It's more about what are the sacrifices we need to make to help the situation along for something that's bigger than just myself. So there's this kind of, and you can see that in Libra too, where Libra is the sign of the balance, which is all about maybe compromise and mediation in relationships. And for that reason, this kind of aspect of self-compromise, you see Saturn coming into play there with its exaltation in the sign of Libra. So Saturn in Aquarius kind of brings in more of that kind of thing. It's more about this thing about making a compromise. There's a certain social quality to Aquarius, though. Air signs have to do with thinking, ideas, communication, maybe like the social contract in society and stuff like that. Whether stuff questions like social justice, equality and fairness. Another part of Aquarius that's important to take in consideration as well is that Aquarius is it's a winter sign, right? It happens in the winter months, and after the winter solstice marks the beginning of Capricorn, and then the next sign after Capricorn is the fixed sign of Aquarius, so it starts to represent after things have been really dark, things are starting to pick up and become light again. And for this reason, Aquarius often has a sort of tendency towards a kind of idealism of like, I think it's maybe fitting for looking at a year of like 2020, where it's like, things can be pretty rough for a while, but it only get like, it's the darkest before the dawn, as they would say, and eventually you're looking for some kind of improvement, right? Now, I've heard like in some of Adam's videos, he was talking about how even the Trump thing of make America great again could be seen as a kind of Aquarius sort of energy. So it's not really like the Aquarius archetype of wanting to make some sort of improvement, either maybe to like bring back some sort of lost nostalgic golden age, or we're going to move into the age of Aquarius and it's going to be all utopian and ideal, but we're going to, make personal sacrifices to improve things and make everything better and move, this kind of improvement towards a kind of idealistic society, and it's kind of futuristic, but there's like this quality of detachment there in Aquarius, and I think that's something that you might be able to see when, I mean, let's look at the internet, for example. It's like people, when the internet first came out, there's a lot of this idea of it being like this kind of like free for all digital utopia where people weren't limited by the the restraints of meat space. You could now go into your virtual reality second life and like have a whole, other world where you could build your own fantasy castle in a in a 3D landscape or something like that, and play like RPG games, and you escape your, instead of being a nerdy dude, now you're like a warrior cleric playing like a massively multiplayer RPG. And it's just sort of like this thing of like the idealized utopia thing, kind of, because it's really airy, it could like leave behind some of the physical dimension, and then it might be a bit of a like a false utopia or a dystopia, because you're like, oh, I thought, we're losing out on human contact, like one, real life human experiences, in exchange for spending all our time looking at screens, right? And I saw kind of like a powerful image, which was like in some of the hospitals, I can't remember what state this image is from. It might have been New York, maybe, but there was like, they had all these stands of like I don't know, maybe like 50 or 100 or something, like iPads on these stands, and these were all for palliative care. So there had so many people dying that they were not going to send, and also I guess to reduce risk of exposure to the coronavirus, rather than having like real doctors and nurses coming around, we were just going to set up iPads by hospital beds and have people's faces appear on a screen to talk to the patient, and reduce germ exposure, or cut down on the man. Maybe I don't know if they're going to beam the same message to multiple patients, but this kind of thing where you're like losing, like there's this airy detached thing about like, oh, rather, we're not seeing each other in person anymore, we're doing everything through a screen, doing everything on the internet. And I need to also to remind you that I guess not last year, but this year, in the spring months, pretty much like right after the coronavirus really kicked off in North America, anyways, where I live, we had a few months there of Saturn in Aquarius, right? And that was really when the lockdown really started kicking into gear. Was when you had Saturn in Aquarius. Eventually, Saturn retrograded out of Aquarius and went back into Capricorn, and now Jupiter is there with Saturn going into Aquarius. So the fact that Jupiter's there, Jupiter is more of like benevolent, altruistic, helping kind of planet, and so it may make the stuff a little bit better, especially since Jupiter was in its fall in Capricorn. So when Jupiter's in its fall in Capricorn, it's not a very, Jupiter stands for luck. It's not a very lucky time to have Jupiter in its fall. And now Jupiter's more neutral. It's not in Aquarius. It's not good. It's not bad, but it's better than being in Capricorn for Jupiter. So and some people are saying that the Jupiter and Saturn together into Aquarius could, it could point to there being a vaccine that actually does a pretty good job, maybe, or that there's something that makes this whole lockdown thing a bit easier, a bit better, because Jupiter's there. But I think like, if you're asking me basically how I'm interpreting it right now, I'm kind of looking at this sort of airy thing that could be very technological. It could be very like, mental communication, very, very much like, the internet really takes over. You've also got questions like, I've had friends that were kind of bugging out about the whole thing about like the AI and like the singularity and all this kind of stuff. And, there's also questions like automation, right? I think it's like actually a really interesting time to think about like futuristic ideas, like what's going to happen when we have self-driving trucks, right? What happen? Are the truck drivers all going to get put out of work? Are we going to have more and more jobs that are taken over by robots essentially and be automated? And are we going to have things like a universal basic income for people? What's the future of work? And it's also with Aquarius, it could also be that you have things kind of like a variety of different situations where you could have some people kind of like safely at home, just, like I'm kind of privileged. I'm just hanging out at home, talking into a microphone, recording myself on a screen. I'm not out there on the front line right now working. So you might have some people experiencing this really kind of like, quarantine bubble of safety, whereas other people are, making sacrifices, putting themselves out in the front line and stuff like that. And there could be these sort of like questions of social equality of what's really fair, or some people taking the hit or other people's not. All those kinds of topics I think are important things to look at with a Jupiter Saturn conjunction moving into Aquarius. Now, one last thing that I'll mention before ending this video is that when Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius, you also have the outer planet Uranus in Taurus right now, right? So Aquarius is a fixed sign, Taurus is a fixed sign, and they're at 90-degree angle from each other, which is the square aspect. So as these two planets move into Aquarius, immediately they're going to start engaging into this square with Uranus to make things even a little bit more, just to spice it up a little bit, as if that wasn't itself in like a kind of a trying kind of dynamic. The planet Mars, which has been stuck in Aries since the summertime, since like July, June. I think it's like the end of June, beginning of July. Mars has been in Aries. Shortly after this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, Mars is going to be ingressing into Taurus, and Mars is going to conjoin Uranus, right? So Mars is, of course, the planet that stands for war, aggression, assertiveness. It also stands for like infectious diseases and injury, and it's the lesser malefic. It generally stands for inflaming, aggravating, causing fights and stuff like that. And Uranus is a planet that has to do with rebelling, fighting. It's like surprise, disruption, a breakthrough, and it's also an innovation and stuff like that. But it's kind of challenging the status quo, doing something out of the ordinary, something unusual. And so Mars, there could be this sort of like really volatile energy with Mars and Uranus, and then those are going to be in a conflict. A square aspect stands for tension and conflict. And so when you look at this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, Jupiter and Saturn is mainly going to stand for, the government, the civilization, and with Aquarius, it could be like these measures that might have something to do with being a bit like isolated. I don't mean Saturn itself. Saturn is associated with stuff like the hermit, right? So the old man, right? The person who is outside of the limits of society, who's off in the mountain or something. It could also be Saturn is like the protective wall and people are kind of like insulated in, but you've got this big boundary dividing or protecting or something like this. So these are all like really Saturnine qualities, whether that's making a kind of a sacrifice, or whether that is putting these kind of limits up or feeling more restricted or a bit like, and like we already know that a lot of people have problems with this stuff, but like what I'm predicting basically is that this stuff is going to come to a head when Mars goes into Taurus, conjuncts Uranus, and sets off this big square, basically. I think it's also kind of funny. Well, I don't know if funny is the right word, but when the election happened in the United States, there's a lot of people that were predicting, like, was there going to be a big civil war or a big disruption or something like that? And I mean, apparently, like, I thought it was pretty clear for the last little while that Trump had lost the election and that he didn't really have a chance in the hell of getting it, even with going to court and stuff like that. And I think they've kind of like they've thrown out like pretty much all of his cases now. I think there was one in Texas, but the Supreme Court just kind of threw that one out and it's kind of like the nail in the coffin for a Trump presidency. And so I think when you get into January, you're going to see Biden take office. And then there's a lot of people out there who are kind of living in a kind of a fantasy land where they really do believe that somehow Trump's going to miraculously win it and stuff like that. And when Biden actually takes office and that, like, the reality sets in, that's probably going to have a bit of a backlash from those people who we're expecting or hoping otherwise. And that's going to time up around the time when Mars goes into Taurus, conjoins Uranus, and sets off the square, right? If there's anything that, I mean, Mars itself is in its detriment in Taurus, right? It's spent a long time really well dignified in Aries, which is probably kind of fueling some of the, Mars in Aries is probably fueling some of this animosity and but once it goes into Taurus, it's like Taurus is a fixed Venusian sign, and so it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like it could be like a kind of a stubborn fighter. Like there could be the people who are like not willing to just sort of like, they're gonna keep fighting, but it's kind of like a downhill battle, and they're just kind of fighting but losing, and it's you also you should consider too that in traditional astrology, squares weren't just like, it wasn't like two planets in a square with each other had equal footing. It was the planet that was more progressed. Hold on, let me just think about this. Yeah, it would be like the planet that's more progressed along the zodiac was said to be in the superior position. Um, or I don't. It kind of would get confusing because I don't mean like whatever planet's closest to the end, but let's say, for example, I have like let's say I've got Scorpio and Leo to give a different example. Like for a planet in Scorpio to meet Leo, it has to go all the way through 10 signs before it can get to Leo. Whereas Leo just has to go through Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio. It's not as short. It's a short trip to go from one position to the other, but it's a long trip to go from one position, if you get what I'm saying. And when it comes to, okay, so you got Aquarius and Taurus. Um, Taurus has to go through a whole bunch of zodiac signs before it can get to the Aquarius position, whereas Aquarius just has to go Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, right? So because that kind of thing where it's not like they're not they're not evenly matched basically, and the Aquarius planets have the edge on the Taurus planets basically. So if you had Mars and Uranus in Taurus and a square to Saturn and Jupiter and Aquarius, it's like what the ancient astrologers would say is that the Aquarius planets are in the position of decimating the Taurus planets. And what do they mean by decimating? Decimation is a reference to this idea of taking an army and basically killing every 10th person. So that means that you don't, it's not, the army itself isn't like completely annihilated, but it's like it's like being taxed in a way. It's being reduced. It's like, you know, you you have to pay like the tariff to the other side or something like that. The other side is demanding a kind of, it's kind of draining out the energy of in the dynamic. So, and if you also look at the fact that you've got Mars in poor dignity in Taurus, and then Saturn in strong dignity in Aquarius, there's also argument to be made that Saturn is better dignified in Aquarius than it is in Capricorn, because Saturn's a triplicity ruler for air signs. Now that gets kind of technical. I won't get into all that right now, but like you've got a really strong Saturn and you've got a Mars that is just moving out of a place where it's strong into a place where it's not very strong, and then basically just getting like, it's, I don't want to use like, I'm going to try to keep the language clean, but let's just say it's like there could be this sort of like the aggressive wanting to fight back, wanting to wanting to rebel, but that's going to get completely just screwed over by this. You know, it's like you're going up against something. To use a Taurus metaphor, it could be like you mess with the bull, you get the horns, right? But maybe not in this situation. It's the bull that is answering to losing in a way in the battle to Saturn. So I think if you're on this, like, I think it's better, like the astrology wise, I think it's gives a sign that it's better to be probably in the position of supporting things like lockdowns, of quarantines, of like, I'm not that keen on living my whole life through the internet like anybody else. And there's a lot of things that I think that it's fair to be critical about it, but I think those who are really going to be rebelling, there might be some little dramatic thing, but it's sort of like it could just like fizzle out and it'd be like, oh, I was expecting this big, this big kickback, but it kind of got brought under control without too much trouble, because you've got this Saturn stands for authority, you've got the conjunction of kings, and that's in a really like dignified position, whereas the stuff that, I mean, Mars also represents the virus itself, and so it could also be an interesting to read this dynamic as the virus itself kind of being brought under control by the governmental forces of the Jupiter Saturn conjunction with stuff like vaccination, etc. That's kind of how I'm reading it anyways. I think that's enough for now though. Hopefully you guys like this video. Hopefully it sort of makes sense. If anybody has any questions, or if you want to continue a discussion about this or whatever, you can leave comments in the comment section. If anybody wants some astrology readings too, I'm open for business. I do natal charts. I'm getting into doing solar returns and stuff like that as well these days. And, I can always do transit charts, and I'm experimenting with horary too. So if you have a, missing item or, these classic horary questions, if you're trying to do some good old fortune telling or something like that, I think horary might work better than tarot cards. Just saying. But these are all kind of services that I'm offering, and I'm learning and I'm practicing. I've got a certification in Hellenistic natal astrology. So if you just want a birth chart, I can do that. This is my little sales pitch at the end of the video, I guess. If you want some astrological services, hit me up. Thanks.